Okay everyone, today's last lecture is going to be about amines. So amines are compounds that sort of center around a central nitrogen atom in the compound. There are three classifications of amines. Primary. In a primary amine there's only one R group, which means your nitrogen is only connected to one carbon. If you have two H's, it's a primary amine, which means that your amine is going to have to be, your amine functional group has to be at the end of your compound. Here we have primary amine. In this case, you have two R groups on your nitrogen. You only have one hydrogen. And here we have a tertiary amine, which means you're not bonded to any hydrogens. So that will look something like this. All amines, nitrogen is going to be the center point of your compound. So let's talk a little bit about nomenclature. We have two different, before we go on to that, let's identify what types of, what classification of amines we have in each parts of these compounds. Here we have the compound spermine, which is isolated from semen. There are a couple of different amine functional groups in this compound. There are four. See if you can identify them as being one of the three classifications. Here we have primary, primary. And when your nitrogen is only bonded to one hydrogen, those are secondary amines. Okay, let's do this again. Find your amine group, functional group. What's its classification? What about this one? This is MDMA is methyl 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, which is ecstasy. This was interesting. Yeah, this is Demerol. Meperidine. Something you guys probably come in contact with frequently. Here we have the nomenclature. This is just for the primary amines. We have two different sets of naming rules. One for just primary amines and one to cover when we have more than one substituent on the nitrogen itself. Okay, so we're going to start by identifying the longest carbon chain with the amine group. And what you're going to do is change the E of the parent name to amine. So if you had ethane, it would be ethanamine. And if you have any substituents, you're going to have to number so that your N has the priority. In other words, in this second example, you always start with the carbon that's closest to your amine functional group. The rest of your substituents sort of play second fiddle here when you have an amine. Okay, so let's go ahead and name this one, and then we can go back to the previous example. Here we have, to name it like we normally do, we have a 3-chloro, a 2-methyl, and this is butane, so this would be butanamine. Because this is sort of complicated to say with the butanamine, a lot of times you'll see it written like this, butylamine. Either way is actually correct. So you could say 3-chloro 2-methyl butylamine, and that would be as correct as writing butanamine. That convention is completely up to you, and you can use either one if you want. Here we have one. Name this as you would a regular alkane, cyclohexane. We're going to take that last E off and add amine. So we have cyclohexanamine. You could also write cyclohexylamine. This is technically what we call the common name, and sometimes the common name is more common than the systematic version. Okay, so let's talk about nomenclature for secondary and tertiary amines. Here we have to find the longest carbon chain that's attached to the nitrogens. Now, so you have to pick one of the 2 or 3 substituents on your nitrogen, those R groups, and just pick whichever one is longer. So basically the more complicated one is what gets the parent name. And you do the same thing to the ending that you did before, change that E to amine. And then you're going to go back and name those other substituents on the N itself as substituents. And you're going to alphabetize those. And instead of using numbers, you're going to use N as the, quote, number to identify where it's located in the compound. Okay. And now here's my tip. If you have identical R groups, just use di or tri. So what kind of amine is this? Primary, secondary, or tertiary? Well, there are no H's. That means it must be tertiary. Okay, so I'm going to find my longest carbon chain that's attached to the N, and that's a 4-membered ring. So I'm going to call that butanamine. And now I'm just going to name these other groups, the other R groups, as substituents. So that they're both ethyls. So what I have to do is write N, and those N's are sort of italicized. You're not going to be able to write italicized N's in your handwriting, but if you had to type them, they would be italicized. N diethyl butanamine. N diethyl butanamine. So do you see where those N's are coming in? Instead of writing 1,2-diethyl or 2,5-diethyl, we have to write them as NN, because that tells us those are both located on the N carbon, or on the nitrogen, I should say, itself. What kind of amine is this? Okay, find your longest carbon chain. Okay, this is a little bit tricky. So here we have a hexane, and here your I'm just thinking. Trying to think if there was an easier way to explain this. So you're just going to have to identify that your amine is on carbon 3 by putting the 3 in between the parent name and your suffix that identifies your functional group. So 3-amine, hexane, 3-amine. And then we have one other substituent that's an ethyl. So we have to write N, N-ethyl hexane 3-amine. Okay, here's one. Oh. It's getting late, can't spell. Cyclopentanamine. And then this is a propyl. And propyl 2-cyclopentanamine. Okay, now you guys should be able to do the rest of these examples. So just come back and check your answers to make sure you're doing okay. Now I didn't start numbering here. That's not a carbon. That's not number 1. That's nitrogen. This is carbon 1. 4,6-dimethylheptanamine. And here's one where you have to draw the compound from the name itself. So always start at the end. It says amine. Start with writing your N. Okay, then work backwards to the next something or other. Here it says cyclopentyl. Oops. My pen got away from me. Cyclopentyl means that that is your most complicated substituent on your nitrogen. And then you have N-ethyl. Now, you do have to fill in all of the H's on that hydrogen. You can't, they're not implied. So you have to write that there's that H there. And that is N-ethyl cyclopentylamine. You'll notice this on your homework. I wrote the YL instead of the AN. So instead of cyclopentanamine, I wrote cyclopentylamine. That doesn't, just because there's a Y doesn't mean it's an ine, a triple bond, an alkyne. It was just used as a substituent, and I didn't think to use the AN, I'm sorry. So just treat that as you would the AN, cyclopentanamine. Same thing. I'm not going to talk any bit about interesting amines. When we get to biochemistry in next week's section, we'll be talking quite a bit about amines, so I'm going to save that for next week. If you have any questions in between now and when that quiz is due, please let me know. Otherwise, good luck with week 6.